The photograph was discovered in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Newark on August 3, 1951, 16 years after the family had vanished. It showed 47 people arranged in concentric circles on the lawn of a Victorian mansion, all of them wearing white. At the center stood two children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 years old, holding hands. Their faces were identical. Behind them, arranged by height and age, were their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Every face shared the same narrow chin, the same deep-set eyes, the same slight asymmetry in the left eyebrow. The bank manager who opened the box said the photograph made his skin crawl. It wasn't the uniformity of features that disturbed him. It was the notation on the back, written in fountain pen. The 47. Genesis complete. May 1936. Beneath the photograph was a leather-bound genealogy, its pages thick with ink and corrections. The family tree didn't branch. It spiraled inward. Names connecting to names in loops and returns. Marriages between first cousins, second cousins, uncle to niece. Lines that should have diverged instead collapsing back into themselves across 7 generations. At the bottom of the final page, in the same fountain pen hand, purity maintained. The blood remains unbroken. This is not a story about inbreeding as genetic catastrophe. This is a story about belief, about a family that convinced itself that power, intelligence, and moral authority could be concentrated and purified through controlled marriage, that dilution was corruption, that the outside world was contamination. This is a story about how an idea, nurtured across generations, becomes indistinguishable from faith. And this is a story about what happens when that faith demands the ultimate sacrifice, the erasure of individual desire in service of collective destiny. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? Have you ever heard whispers in your own family about marriages that seem too close? About secrets kept to preserve a name? Drop a comment below and make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what follows is going to challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty and the price of purity. To understand how 47 people could vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a photograph and a genealogy that reads like a manifesto, we must go back to the winter of 1823, to a farmhouse outside Trenton, New Jersey, where a man named Cornelius Vandermeer made a decision that would shape the next century of his lineage. Cornelius was a Dutch Reformed minister who had broken with his congregation over a theological dispute about predestination and the elect. He believed that salvation was not merely a matter of grace, but of bloodline, that God's chosen people were literally chosen, their election visible in the purity of their descent. He preached that intermarriage with the unconverted was spiritual adultery, that each generation had a duty to preserve the sanctity of the line. When his congregation rejected this doctrine, Cornelius withdrew. He took his wife, his 3 sons, his 2 daughters, and his widowed sister, and he moved to a 200-acre farm in Hunterdon County. He called it New Canaan. He began keeping a journal, a thick ledger bound in black cloth, in which he recorded not just the births and deaths of his family, but their marriages, their children's marriages, their grandchildren's marriages. He developed a system. First cousins were permissible. Uncle to niece was acceptable if the age gap was not scandalous. The goal was to keep the blood concentrated, the inheritance undivided, the faith uncorrupted. He wrote, "We are the remnant. We are the preserved. The world outside is Babylon, and we will not be defiled." His children obeyed. In 1831, his eldest son Peter married his first cousin, Cornelius's niece. In 1834, his daughter Anicha married her uncle, Cornelius's younger brother, who had joined the family at New Canaan after his own wife died in childbirth. The children of these unions were healthy, intelligent, and indoctrinated. They grew up hearing that their family was special, that their blood carried something precious, that the outside world was a threat to be managed, not engaged. By 1850, the Vandermeer family numbered 23 people, all of them living on the farm, all of them married to each other or waiting to be. Cornelius died in 1856, but his journal continued. His son Peter took over the record-keeping, and then Peter's son, and then his grandson. The family acquired more land. They built a textile mill, then a lumber mill, then a small bank. They were prosperous, insular, and methodical. They educated their children at home. They attended no church but their own, a small chapel Cornelius had built on the property, where services were conducted in Dutch and English, where the sermons always returned to the same theme: the sanctity of the bloodline, the duty of preservation, the danger of contamination. By 1900, the family had moved from the farm to a mansion in Montclair, a 3-story Victorian with iron gates and hedges tall enough to block the view from the street. The genealogy had become an obsession. Every marriage was planned years in advance. Matches arranged not by love, but by genetic calculus. The family employed a private physician, Dr. Ernst Kellerman, a German immigrant who shared their belief in eugenics and racial purity. Kellerman kept meticulous records of each child's health, intelligence, and physical traits. He measured skulls, recorded eye color, tracked the inheritance of specific features across generations. He reported his findings to the family patriarch, who by then was Peter's grandson, a man named Cornelius III. Cornelius III was a banker, a man of quiet authority and rigid discipline. He expanded the family's wealth through investments in railroads and real estate, but his true passion was the genealogy. He commissioned the leather-bound book found in the safety deposit box, a masterwork of calligraphy and obsessive documentation. He hired an artist to paint the family tree on the ceiling of the mansion's library, a sprawling mural in gold leaf and oil, names and dates spiraling inward like a nautilus shell. He instituted a rule: no member of the family could marry outside the bloodline without unanimous consent of the family council, a body consisting of himself, his 2 brothers, and his eldest son. The rule was never challenged. By 1920, the family had developed its own language, a hybrid of Dutch, English, and invented terms that only they understood. They had their own rituals. Every Sunday, they gathered in the library beneath the painted genealogy and recited the names of their ancestors, a litany that took 20 minutes to complete. Every marriage was preceded by a ceremony in which the couple stood before the family council and swore an oath. I vow to preserve the blood. I vow to honor the line. I vow to reject the contamination of the world. The children born into this system were not unhappy, at least not visibly. They were educated, well-fed, and taught to see themselves as exceptional, but they were also isolated. They had no friends outside the family. They attended no public schools, no social events, no gatherings where they might meet someone whose last name was not Vandermeer. The family controlled every aspect of their lives, from their education to their marriages to their careers. The boys were trained to manage the family's businesses. The girls were trained to manage the household and bear children. Deviation was unthinkable. And then, in 1928, something changed. Cornelius III's youngest daughter, a woman named Elise, fell in love with a man she met at a charity event in Newark. His name was Thomas Callahan, an Irish-American lawyer with no connection to the family, no knowledge of their beliefs, no place in the genealogy. Elise was 23 years old. She had been promised in marriage to her second cousin, a man named Hendrik, but she had not yet taken the oath. She began meeting Thomas in secret, writing him letters, imagining a life beyond the iron gates and the painted genealogy. When Cornelius III discovered the relationship, he convened the family council. The meeting took place in the library, beneath the gold leaf mural. Elise was brought before them and asked to explain herself. She told them she loved Thomas, that she wanted to marry him, that she could not spend her life with Hendrik, a man she barely knew and did not love. Cornelius III listened without expression. When she finished, he asked her a single question. "Do you renounce the blood?" Elise hesitated. She looked at her mother, her brothers, her cousins, all of them watching her with the same narrow chin, the same deep-set eyes. She looked at the ceiling, at the spiraling names, at the 7 generations of Vandermeers who had chosen the family over the world. And then she said, "No, I do not renounce the blood. But I cannot marry Hendrik." Cornelius III stood. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a leather folder. Inside was a document, a contract that every member of the family signed on their 18th birthday. It stated that any member who refused a sanctioned marriage or attempted to marry outside the bloodline would forfeit their inheritance, their name, and their place in the family. Elise had signed it 5 years earlier. Cornelius III placed the document in front of her and said, "You have a choice. Marry Hendrik and remain a Vandermeer, or marry Thomas Callahan and cease to exist." Elise chose Thomas. She left the mansion that night with a single suitcase and never returned. The family erased her. Her name was struck from the genealogy. Her photographs were removed from the albums. Her room was emptied and locked. At the next Sunday gathering, when the family recited the names of their ancestors, Elise's name was not spoken. It was as if she had never been born. But her departure had consequences. It created a crack in the system, a whisper of doubt. If Elise could leave, could others? The family council responded with a new rule. All marriages would now take place before the age of 21, before the children were old enough to develop attachments to the outside world. The ceremonies became more elaborate, more binding. The oaths were lengthened, the vows made more explicit. The family physician, Dr. Kellerman, now in his 70s, began advocating for even closer unions. He argued that first-cousin marriages were insufficient, that the family should pursue uncle-niece and double first-cousin pairings to maximize genetic concentration. Cornelius III agreed. In 1932, the family arranged the marriage of Cornelius III's eldest son, Peter Form, to his niece, the daughter of Cornelius III's deceased brother. She was 19. Peter was 34. The ceremony took place in the library beneath the genealogy. The bride wore white. The groom wore a black suit. They stood before the family council and recited the oath, and then Peter placed a gold ring on her finger, a ring that had been worn by every Vandermeer bride for 3 generations. The family celebrated with a dinner that lasted 4 hours, course after course, wine and hymns and speeches about the sanctity of the blood. The marriage produced 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, born in February 1934 during a snowstorm that buried Montclair under 2 feet of snow. The family physician attended the birth. He measured the infants, recorded their weight and length, examined their features. He reported to Cornelius III that the children were perfect, that they bore all the hallmarks of the Vandermeer line, that they were proof of the family's success. Cornelius III named them Cornelius V and Annika, after the family's founder and his sister. The twins became the center of the family's attention. They were photographed constantly, their growth documented in meticulous detail. They were dressed identically, taught identically, treated not as individuals but as symbols, as evidence that the family's experiment was working. By the time they were 2 years old, they could recite the names of their ancestors. By the time they were 4, they understood that they were special, that their blood was pure, that they had a duty to preserve it. And then, in May 1936, the family gathered for the photograph. It was Cornelius III's 80th birthday, and he wanted a record, a single image that would capture the culmination of his life's work. He hired a photographer from Newark, a man who knew nothing about the family and was paid to ask no questions. The family assembled on the lawn of the mansion, all 47 of them dressed in white. The twins stood at the center, holding hands, their faces solemn. Behind them, arranged by height and generation, were their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. The photographer set up his camera, adjusted the lens, and took the picture. 3 months later, the family vanished. The disappearance was not sudden. It was methodical, planned, executed with the same precision the family applied to everything. In August 1936, the mansion was sold to a real estate developer for a sum far below its market value. The sale was handled by a lawyer in Newark, a man who had never met the family and received his instructions by mail. The family's bank accounts were closed, the funds transferred to a series of trusts and offshore holdings that could not be traced. The textile mill, the lumber mill, the investments, all of it was liquidated, converted to cash and gold, and moved. The neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The Vandermeers had always been private, and their departure was quiet. One day, the mansion was occupied. The next, it was empty. The gates were locked, the hedges untrimmed, the windows dark. The real estate developer who purchased the property found it in perfect condition. Every room cleaned, every surface dusted, every piece of furniture removed. The only thing left behind was the library. And in the library, the only thing that remained was the painted genealogy on the ceiling, the gold leaf names spiraling inward, the final entry reading, Genesis Complete. May 1936. The developer tried to paint over it, but the gold leaf bled through the primer. He tried to scrape it off, but the plaster beneath was too fragile. In the end, he sealed the room, locked the door, and sold the mansion to a private buyer who turned it into a boarding house. The library remained sealed for 15 years. In those 15 years, there were rumors. A woman in Trenton claimed she saw Cornelius III boarding a train to Montreal in September 1936, accompanied by a group of people who all looked alike. A clerk at a shipping company in New York said a family matching the Vandermeers' description had chartered a freighter to Argentina in October 1936, paying in gold. A priest in a small town in Pennsylvania said a family of 47 people had attended Mass at his church in November 1936, all of them dressed in white, all of them refusing to give their names. But no evidence was ever found. No records, no photographs, no letters. The family had erased itself as completely as it had erased Elise. In 1951, a lawyer in Newark received a letter instructed to open the safety deposit box at the First National Bank. The letter was unsigned, postmarked from a town in Brazil that did not exist. Inside the box was the photograph, the genealogy, and a note written on a small card. "We were never here." The FBI investigated. They traced the real estate transactions, the bank transfers, the shipping records. They interviewed the neighbors, the lawyer, the photographer who had taken the picture. they found nothing. The family had vanished, and with it, any explanation for why. The case was classified as a mass disappearance, filed away and forgotten. But the photograph remained. It circulated among collectors of strange Americana, appearing in books about unsolved mysteries and vanished communities. People studied the faces, looking for clues, for signs of coercion or distress. They found none. The 47 people in the photograph looked calm, composed, even serene. They looked like a family that knew exactly what it was doing. In 1963, a historian researching Dutch Reformed communities in New Jersey discovered the genealogy in the archives of a private collector. He spent 2 years tracing the family's history, piecing together the marriages, the births, the deaths. He published his findings in an obscure academic journal, arguing that the Vandermeers were an extreme example of a phenomenon he called genetic isolationism, a belief system in which a family or community attempts to preserve its identity through controlled reproduction. He noted that similar practices had been documented in royal families, religious sects, and isolated communities around the world, but never with the same level of methodical planning and ideological commitment. He also noted something else. The children born into the later generations of the Vandermeer family showed signs of what he called convergence, a narrowing of physical and cognitive diversity that suggested the family's experiment was beginning to fail. Several children born in the 1920s and 1930s had died in infancy. Others had shown developmental delays, physical deformities, or chronic illnesses. The family physician, Dr. Kellerman, had documented these cases in his records, which were discovered in a storage facility in Newark after his death in 1945. Kellerman's notes revealed that he had warned Cornelius III about the risks of continued inbreeding, but his warnings had been ignored. The family believed that any weakness was temporary, that the blood would purify itself, that faith and discipline could overcome biology. The historian concluded his article with a question. Did the Vandermeers vanish because their experiment succeeded or because it failed? No one answered. In 1978, a woman in São Paulo, Brazil, contacted the American consulate with a story. She said her grandmother, who had recently died, had told her about a family of Americans who had arrived in Brazil in 1936, purchased a large estate in the interior, and lived there in complete isolation for decades. The family spoke a strange language, a mix of Dutch and English and something else she could not identify. They never left the estate, never interacted with the local community, never sent their children to school. Her grandmother had worked as a housekeeper for the family in the 1940s, but she had been dismissed after she asked too many questions. She said the family was obsessed with genealogy, that they kept a massive book in their library, that they performed strange ceremonies in which they recited names and made vows. The consulate forwarded the report to the FBI, but by the time investigators arrived in São Paulo, the woman had disappeared. The estate she described could not be located. The local authorities had no record of any American family purchasing property in the region in the 1930s. The case was closed again, but the story persisted. Over the years, other reports surfaced. A doctor in Chile said he had treated a family in the 1950s that matched the Vandermeers' description, a family that paid in gold and refused to provide any personal information. A teacher in Uruguay said she had encountered a group of children in the 1960s who all looked identical, who spoke a language she could not identify, who disappeared before she could learn their names. A priest in Paraguay said a family of 47 people had attended his church in the 1970s, all of them dressed in white, all of them refusing to take communion. None of these reports could be verified, but they all shared the same details. A family of identical faces, a language no one could understand, a refusal to engage with the outside world, and a sudden, unexplained disappearance. In 1989, a geneticist at Princeton University published a paper on the long-term effects of sustained inbreeding in isolated human populations. He used the Vandermeer genealogy as a case study, analyzing the patterns of marriage and reproduction across 7 generations. He concluded that the family's experiment had been doomed from the start, that the genetic load accumulated through repeated consanguineous unions would have resulted in severe health problems, reduced fertility, and eventual extinction. He estimated that by the 4th or 5th generation, the family would have been experiencing significant rates of infant mortality, congenital disorders, and cognitive impairment. He argued that the family's disappearance was likely not voluntary but necessary, that they had fled not to preserve their purity, but to hide their failure. But his analysis was based on the genealogy alone. He had no access to medical records, no DNA samples, no way to verify his conclusions. And his paper raised a troubling question. If the family was failing, why did they continue? Why did they keep marrying each other, keep having children, keep reciting the names of their ancestors, even as the evidence of their decline became undeniable? The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of belief itself. The Vandermeers did not see themselves as conducting an experiment. They saw themselves as fulfilling a divine mandate, as preserving something sacred, as resisting a world that sought to corrupt and dilute them. They believed that their suffering, if it existed, was a test, a trial that would ultimately prove their worthiness. They believed that the blood would purify itself, that the weak would be winnowed out, that the strong would endure, and they believed that the outside world could never understand. In 2003, a journalist investigating the history of eugenics in America traveled to Montclair to see the mansion where the Vandermeers had lived. The building had been converted into condominiums, the grounds subdivided and sold. But the library remained, still sealed, still locked. The current owner of the unit that included the library had never opened the door. He said he had tried once, but the lock was rusted shut, and he had decided it was not worth the effort. The journalist convinced him to let a locksmith open it. When the door finally swung open, the room was exactly as it had been left in 1936. The shelves were empty, the floor swept clean, the windows covered with thick curtains, and on the ceiling, the genealogy remained, the gold leaf names still visible, still spiraling inward, still ending with the same inscription, Genesis complete. May 1936, the journalist took photographs. He published an article about the Vandermeers, about their history, about their disappearance. The article generated some interest, a few letters from readers who claimed to have seen the family or heard stories about them. But no new evidence emerged. The case remained unsolved. And then, in 2011, a package arrived at the offices of the New Jersey Historical Society. It contained a single photograph, identical to the one found in the safety deposit box in 1951, except for one detail. On the back, in the same fountain pen hand, was a new inscription, the 47. Genesis continues. May 2011. The photograph showed 47 people arranged in concentric circles on the lawn of a mansion. They were all wearing white. At the center stood 2 children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 years old, holding hands. Their faces were identical. Behind them, arranged by height and age, were their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Every face shared the same narrow chin, the same deep-set eyes, the same slight asymmetry in the left eyebrow. The photograph was analyzed by forensic experts. The paper was modern, the ink less than a year old. The location could not be identified. The people could not be traced. The package had been mailed from a post office in rural Montana, but no one at the post office remembered who had sent it. The FBI reopened the case. They issued a public appeal for information. They received hundreds of tips, none of them credible. The photograph was published in newspapers and online, shared across social media, analyzed by amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists. But no one could explain it. No one could say who the people in the photograph were, where they had come from, or why they had sent it. The case remains open. What kind of family convinces itself that love is contamination, that the outside world is a threat, that the only way to preserve power is to marry itself? What kind of belief system transforms children into symbols, marriages into contracts, and individual desire into collective duty? And what kind of faith allows a family to vanish, to erase itself from history, to reappear 75 years later with the same faces, the same clothes, the same unshakable conviction that they are right? The Vandermeers believed they were preserving something sacred. They believed that their blood carried a divine spark, that their lineage was chosen, that their duty was to resist the corruption of the world. They built a system to protect that belief, a system of arranged marriages and oaths and genealogies painted in gold. They sacrificed individual happiness for collective purity. They erased anyone who questioned the system. They disappeared when the system could no longer sustain itself. But the photograph suggests they did not disappear. It suggests they adapted, that they found a new place, a new mansion, a new way to continue the experiment. It suggests that somewhere, in a location unknown, 47 people are still living according to the rules laid down by Cornelius Vandermeer in 1823, still reciting the names of their ancestors, still marrying each other, still believing that they are special, that they are pure, that they are right. And it raises a question that has no answer. If belief is strong enough, if faith is absolute enough, if a family is willing to sacrifice everything, love, freedom, health, even truth, can it survive indefinitely? Can it outlast biology, outlast reason, outlast the world itself? The human capacity for self-deception is nearly infinite. We can convince ourselves of anything if the alternative is too painful to accept. We can call cruelty love, call control protection, call isolation purity. We can build entire systems around a single idea and defend those systems even as they collapse around us. We can erase the people who challenge us, rewrite the histories that contradict us, and vanish into the margins of the world, rather than admit we were wrong. The Vandermeers were not monsters. They were believers. They were people who took an idea about blood and purity and divine election, and followed it to its logical conclusion. They were people who loved their family so much that they were willing to destroy it in order to save it. And maybe they succeeded. Maybe the photograph from 2011 is proof that their system works, that their faith was justified, that their sacrifices were not in vain. Maybe somewhere, right now, there is a family of 47 people living in a mansion with iron gates and tall hedges, reciting the names of their ancestors beneath a ceiling painted in gold, preparing the next generation to carry on the experiment. Or maybe the photograph is a lie. Maybe it was sent by someone who found the original, who learned the story, who wanted to perpetuate the mystery. Maybe the Vandermeers died out decades ago, their bloodline collapsing under the weight of its own purity, their children born sick and weak and unable to survive. Maybe the mansion in the photograph is empty, the people in it ghosts, the inscription a cruel joke. We will never know. The Vandermeers made sure of that. They erased themselves so completely that even their existence is uncertain. Even their story is a rumor. Even their photograph is a question without an answer. But the question remains. And it is not a question about the Vandermeers. It is a question about us. It is a question about what we are willing to believe, what we are willing to sacrifice, what we are willing to call sacred. It is a question about the stories we tell ourselves to justify the systems we build, the families we create, the lives we choose. How far would you go to preserve something you believed was pure? How much would you sacrifice to protect a legacy? And at what point does preservation become destruction? Does love become control? Does faith become delusion? The Vandermeers answered those questions in their own way. They chose purity over love, legacy over freedom, faith over truth. They chose to vanish rather than compromise, to erase themselves rather than change. And maybe in the end, that is the only honest answer. Maybe the only way to preserve something absolutely is to remove it from the world entirely, to seal it away where it cannot be touched, cannot be questioned, cannot be proven wrong. The photograph remains. The genealogy remains. The gold leaf names spiraling inward on the ceiling of a sealed library remain. And somewhere, perhaps, the family remains, still believing, still marrying, still reciting the names of their ancestors, still convinced that they are special, that they are chosen, that they are right. The truth, like the family itself, remains hidden. And maybe that is exactly how they wanted it.